The frost-covered ground crunched beneath Elara's worn leather boots as she crept through the silent forest, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter morning air. The bow in her hands felt heavier than usual, not from its weight, but from the desperation that pressed against her chest like a stone. 3 days had passed since her family's last proper meal, and the hollowness in her younger brother's eyes haunted her thoughts with each careful step she took deeper into the woods. Winter had come early to the village of Thornwick, and with it a cruel hunger that gnawed at every household. The harvest had failed, the traders had stopped coming, and now the people looked to the forest with the same desperation that drove Elara forward through the skeletal trees. Her father's cough had worsened in the night, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of lungs filled with more than just cold air. And how Mother's hands trembled, not just from the morning chill, but from weakness that came from giving her own portions to her children. Elara paused beside a massive oak tree, its bark scarred by countless winters, and listened to the forest's whispered secrets. Somewhere in these woods, game still moved despite the season's harsh grip. She had seen the tracks yesterday, deer prints leading deeper into the territory she rarely dared to explore, and something else, something larger that had left marks she couldn't quite identify in the snow. The silver pendant at her throat, a gift from her grandmother before the old woman had passed, caught the weak sunlight filtering through the bare branches above. It had been carved from a piece of meteoric stone, or so the stories claimed, and bore strange markings that seemed to shift and dance when she wasn't looking directly at them. Her grandmother had always insisted it would protect her, though from what, the old woman had never been entirely clear. A sound broke through her concentration, the soft pad of footsteps moving through the underbrush with a grace that spoke of wild things and untamed spaces. Elara's heart quickened as she nocked an arrow, drawing the bowstring back with practiced ease despite the way her fingers had grown numb from the cold. Through the trees ahead she caught sight of movement, a flash of silver-gray fur that made her breath catch in her throat. The wolf that stepped into the small clearing before her was unlike any she had ever seen. Its coat gleamed like moonlight on water, and when it turned its head in her direction, she found herself staring into eyes that held an intelligence far beyond what should have resided in any wild creature. They were silver, those eyes, bright and knowing, and filled with something that made her question whether she was hunter or hunted in this moment. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, girl and wolf regarded each other across the space between them. The creature made no move to flee, showed no sign of the fear that should have sent it bolting deeper into the forest. Instead, it seemed to be waiting, as if this encounter had been ordained by forces beyond their understanding. There was something almost regal in its bearing, a dignity that spoke of bloodlines far older than the village she called home. Elara's grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, warnings about the deep woods and the things that dwelt there, creatures that wore familiar shapes but belonged to realms beyond mortal understanding. But hunger was a more immediate concern than half-remembered tales, and the wolf before her represented meat enough to feed her family for days. Her finger found the familiar groove in her bowstring, and she drew in a breath that tasted of snow and desperation. The arrow flew true, as her arrows always did, finding its mark in the creature's chest with a sound like thunder in the stillness of the winter morning. The wolf stumbled, those impossible silver eyes widening not with pain, but with something that looked remarkably like surprise, as if it had never considered that it might be vulnerable to such mortal weapons. It fell to its knees first, then onto its side, and the light in those ancient eyes began to dim. But even as death claimed the creature, something else began to happen. The air around its fallen form shimmered like heat waves rising from summer stone, and for just a moment, Elara could have sworn she saw something else lying there in the snow, not a wolf, but a figure almost human in prey. Shape, with features too beautiful to be entirely mortal, and ears that tapered to delicate points. The vision lasted only an instant before the shimmer faded, leaving nothing but the wolf's still form bleeding scarlet onto the pristine white ground. Elara lowered her bow with hands that had begun to shake, though whether from cold or something else entirely, she couldn't say. The forest around her had gone silent in a way that felt different from the usual winter quiet, as if even the trees were holding their breath. The silver pendant at her throat had grown warm against her skin, warmer than it had any right to be in the freezing air, and the strange markings carved into its surface seemed to pulse with their own inner light. She approached the fallen wolf slowly, her footsteps muffled by the snow that had begun to fall in large, soft flakes. Up close, the creature was even more magnificent than she had realized, its fur so fine it seemed to have been spun from starlight itself. The arrow had struck clean through its heart, a merciful death at least, though mercy felt like a hollow comfort when faced with the strange sorrow that had settled over the clearing like a shroud. The work of field dressing the animal was familiar, something she had done countless times with smaller game, but her hands hesitated as they reached for her skinning knife. There was something wrong here, something that made her grandmother's warnings echo louder in her mind, but the memory of her brother's hollow cheeks and her father's labored breathing drove her forward. She had come too far and risked too much to turn back now, no matter what strange fancies her mind might conjure. By the time she finished her work and began the long walk home, the snow was falling in earnest, covering her tracks and the evidence of what had transpired in the clearing. The meat would feed her family well, and the pelt would bring warmth to their small home, but the weight in her pack felt heavier than it should have, as if she carried more than just flesh and bone on her shoulders. The village of Thornwick huddled against the hillside like a collection of children seeking shelter from a storm, its thatched roofs white with snow, and its windows glowing with the warm yellow light of hearth fires. Smoke rose from the chimneys in thin gray columns that were quickly dispersed by the wind, carrying with them the scents of burning wood and whatever meager meals the families within could manage. Elara's own home sat near the edge of the village, a modest stone cottage that had housed 3 generations of her family and bore the weathered dignity of structures built to endure. Her mother, Miron, looked up from the small fire she had been tending when Elara pushed through the heavy wooden door, her eyes immediately going to the pack on her daughter's shoulders. The relief that crossed her thin face was immediate and profound, though she tried to hide it behind the stern expression she had worn more often as the winter wore on. Behind her, Elara's brother Tam raised his head from where he had been lying on the small bed they shared, his 12-year-old frame looking far too fragile beneath the pile of worn blankets. "You found something," Miron said, and it wasn't quite a question. Her voice carried the rough edge that came from too many days of rationing her own food to ensure her children ate, and her hands shook slightly as she reached out to help Elara remove the pack. Elara nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. The strange encounter in the clearing felt like a half-remembered dream now, something that belonged to a different world than this small room with its familiar sense of wood smoke and her father's medicinal herbs. She could hear him coughing in the back room, a sound that had grown progressively worse over the past weeks, and the urgency of their situation pushed aside whatever doubts she might have harbored about her morning's work. The meat was received with a joy that made Elara's chest tight with emotion. Tam's eyes brightened for the first time in days as the rich scent of cooking venison began to fill their small home, and even her father managed to sit up when the smell reached the back room where he had been resting. It was the first time in weeks that their evening meal felt like a celebration rather than a careful rationing of their dwindling supplies. "Where did you find such a fine animal?" her father, Goran, asked between careful spoonfuls of the stew her mother had prepared. His voice rasped with the effort of speaking, that there was genuine curiosity in his tired eyes. Elara found herself hesitating, the memory of those silver eyes and the strange shimmer that had surrounded the wolf's death rising unbidden in her mind. "Deep in the forest," she said finally, which was true enough without being the whole truth. It was alone, separated from its pack perhaps. Her father nodded, accepting the explanation without question, but her mother's sharp eyes lingered on Elara's face, as if she could read the secrets written there. Miran had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when her daughter was holding something back, a talent that had served her well during Elara's more adventurous childhood years. The meal was the best they had shared in months, rich and filling in a way that reminded them all of better times when the harvest had been plentiful and the traders' wagons had rolled regularly through their village. For a few precious hours, the cottage felt warm and safe, filled with the comfortable sounds of a family gathered around their hearth. Tam's laughter rang out as their father told one of his old stories, and even Miran smiled as she watched her children's faces light up with something other than worry for the first time in weeks. But as night settled over the village like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the deep cold that seemed to seep through even the thickest walls, Elara found herself unable to shake the feeling that something had changed. The silver pendant at her throat remained warm against her skin, warmer than it had ever been before, and when she closed her eyes, she could still see those intelligent silver orbs staring at her with what had looked remarkably like recognition. She was pulling on her nightgown when the first sound reached her ears, a howling that rose from the forest beyond the village, mournful and wild and filled with a grief that seemed to make the very air tremble. It was answered by another voice, and then another, until the night was filled with a chorus of wolf song that spoke of loss and fury, and something darker than either. Elara moved to the small window that faced the forest, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out into the darkness. The snow was falling more heavily now, turning the world beyond into a shifting landscape of white and shadow, but even through the storm, she could see lights moving between the trees. Not the warm yellow glow of lanterns or torches, but something colder and more ethereal, like captured starlight given form and purpose. The howling grew closer, and with it came a sound that made her blood run cold, the rhythmic beat of hooves against the frozen ground, moving with a purpose that spoke of riders who knew exactly where they were going. The lights in the forest began to move faster, weaving between the trees with an impossible grace that defied the storm and the darkness, and Elara realized with growing dread that they were heading directly for the village. She was about to call out to her parents when the first rider emerged from the forest, and the words died in her throat. Even at a distance, even through the heavy snowfall, there was something unmistakably otherworldly about the figure that sat astride the ghostly pale horse. The rider's cloak billowed behind them like captured shadow, and when they raised their head to look toward the village, Elara caught a glimpse of features that were beautiful in a way that seemed almost painful to behold. More riders followed, materializing from the storm-lashed forest like figures from a half-remembered nightmare. They moved with a unity of purpose that spoke of hunters on the trail of specific prey, and the way they turned their attention toward the village left no doubt about their destination. The howling reached a crescendo and then stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt more ominous than the wild voices had been. Elara backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs as understanding began to dawn. The wolf she had killed, the strange shimmer she had seen as it died, the impossible intelligence in those silver eyes, her grandmother's warnings about the deep woods suddenly seemed far more pressing than half-remembered folklore. Whatever she had taken from the forest that morning, it had been more than just an animal, and now something had come to collect a debt she hadn't known she owed. The riders reached the edge of the village and paused, their mounts snorting clouds of vapor that glowed faintly in the darkness. For a moment, Elara dared to hope they might pass by, that whatever business had brought them from the depths of the forest might not concern her small family. But then the lead rider raised one hand, and she saw something that made her knees weak with terror. Fingers that ended in claws like polished obsidian, and skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. A sound like thunder rolled across the village, though the sky above remained clear of storms, and every door in Thornwick burst open simultaneously. The riders began to move again, their horses' hooves ringing against the cobblestones with a sound like struck crystal, and Elara knew with absolute certainty that they were coming for her. She turned from the window to find her family already stirring, awakened by the supernatural thunder that had shaken their home. Her father was struggling to sit up in bed, his face pale with more than just illness, while her mother stood frozen in the doorway to their room, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from recognizing something that shouldn't had exist. "Elara," her mother whispered, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood more about what was happening than she had ever let on. "What did you do?" Before Elara could answer, their door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and bitter cold air. The figure that stepped through the ruined doorway had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the lintel, and when he straightened to his full height, he seemed to fill the small room with a presence that made the very walls seem to shrink away from him. He was beautiful in the way that winter storms were beautiful, terrible, and magnificent, and utterly inhuman. His hair fell in waves the color of moonlight on water, and his skin held the pale perfection of fresh snow. But it was his eyes that captured Elara's attention, and held it like a physical force, silver as the wolf's had been, but filled with a cold fury that made her previous encounter seem gentle by comparison. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of wind through ancient trees and the whisper of snow against glass. "Mortal huntress," he said, and each word seemed to resonate with power that made the air itself tremble. "You have taken something that was not yours to claim." Elara found her voice with an effort that felt like lifting a stone from her chest. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she knew they rang false. The Fey warrior for that was surely what he was, one of the creatures from her grandmother's most dire warnings, tilted his head in a gesture that would have been curious if not for the deadly intent that radiated from every line of his form. "Do you not? Then perhaps you would care to explain how you came to possess the heart's blood of Lord Silvius of the Winter Court, cousin to the Autumn King and guardian of the sacred groves." The silver pendant at Elara's throat grew so hot it nearly burned her skin, and she realized with growing horror that the wolf she had killed had been far more than just an animal. The shimmer she had seen, the almost human form that had flickered in her vision as the creature did it, had been real, a transformation interrupted by death but not entirely concealed. "I didn't know," she whispered, and this time the words carried the weight of absolute truth. "I was hunting to feed my family. We're starving, and I saw a wolf." "You saw a member of the Seelie court," the warrior interrupted, his voice cutting through her explanation like a blade through silk. "A lord of the Fey realm, bound by ancient magic to walk these mortal lands during the season of his power. And you, mortal child, put an iron arrow through his heart." The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing, heavy with implications that Elara was only beginning to understand. Around her, her family cowered against the walls of their small home, her brother whimpering softly as he pressed his face against their mother's shoulder. Her father had managed to stand, despite his illness, and was reaching for the small knife he kept beside his bed, though what good mortal steel might do against a creature like the one that had invaded their home, Elara couldn't imagine. "The penalty for slaying one of the High Fae is clearly established in the old laws," the warrior continued, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by her father's futile gesture of defiance. "Life for life, blood for blood, power for power. You will come with me now, huntress, to face the judgment of the autumn court." "No," Elara said, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. "I won't leave my family. They need me." The warrior's expression shifted, and for a moment, something that might have been amusement flickered in those silver depths. "You speak as if you have a choice in the matter. The laws that bind your kind to ours are older than your village, older than the kingdom that claims dominion over these lands. You shed fey blood, mortal child. The debt must be paid." He raised one hand, fingers spread wide, and the air around them began to shimmer with the same ethereal light Elara had seen moving through the forest. Power gathered in the small room, making her skin tingle and her teeth ache, and she realized that whatever happened next, her life as she had known it was already over. "Please," she said, desperation making her voice break. "Take me if you must, but let me say goodbye. Let me make sure they'll survive without me." The warrior studied her for a long moment, his beautiful, terrible face unreadable. "You show concern for these mortals," he said finally. "Interesting. Most of your kind think only of themselves when faced with the consequences of their actions." "They are my family," Elara replied, as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did. Something shifted in the warrior's expression, a crack appearing in the mask of cold fury he wore. "Very well," he said at last. "You may have until the moon reaches its zenith to set your affairs in order. But know this, huntress attempt to flee, and I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. The debt will be paid, one way or another." He stepped back toward the ruined doorway, his form beginning to blur at the edges, as if he were made of mist and shadow rather than flesh and bone. "I will be waiting," he said, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the bitter scent of winter wind and the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Elara collapsed onto the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The reality of what had just occurred crashed over her like a wave, and she found herself struggling to breathe past the panic that constricted her chest. She had perhaps an hour before the moon reached its peak, an hour to arrange for her family's survival before she was taken to face judgment for a crime she hadn't even known she was committing. Her mother was the first to move, crossing the room to kneel beside Elara's chair and take her daughter's cold hands in her own. "Tell me everything," Miran said, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Elara told her story in halting sentences, from the moment she had entered the deep forest to the strange shimmer she had seen as the wolf died. Her mother listened in silence, her face growing paler with each detail, and when Elara finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Your grandmother warned me this day might come," Miran said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She told me that the pendant she gave you would protect you from most supernatural threats, but that it might also draw their attention if you ever shed blood in the deep woods. I thought I hoped it was just another of her old stories." Elara fingered the silver pendant at her throat, feeling the strange warmth that still radiated from its carved surface. "What am I supposed to do? I can't leave you here to starve, but if I try to run, you'll go with him," her father said firmly, his voice rough but determined. "You'll face whatever judgment this court of his demands, and you'll survive it. You're stronger than you know, daughter, and if there's a way to make this right, you'll find it. But the family—" "We'll manage," her mother interrupted. "The meat you brought today will last us several weeks if we're careful, and spring isn't so far away. We survived before you were old enough to hunt, and we'll survive now." Her hands tightened around Elara's fingers. "What we couldn't survive is losing you to some hopeless flight through the wilderness." At least this way, there's a chance you might come home." Tam had crept closer during their conversation, his young face set in lines too serious for his age. "Will you really be able to come back?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Elara pulled him into a fierce embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair and trying to memorize the feel of his thin arms around her waist. "I don't know," she admitted, because she had never been able to lie to her brother successfully. "But I promise I'll try. I promise I'll do everything I can to find a way home." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate preparations. Her mother packed a small bundle of belongings, warm clothes, a few pieces of bread, the small mite her grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday. Her father pressed a leather pouch into her hands, heavy with the few coins they had managed to save over the years, though what use mortal currency might be in a fey court, none of them could say. Most importantly, her mother removed a small leather journal from its hiding place beneath their hearthstone, its pages filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. "She wrote down everything she knew about the old ways," Miran explained, pressing the book into Elara's hands. "The stories, the laws, the ways to navigate their world without losing yourself. I should have given this to you years ago, but I hoped you'd never need it." Elara clutched the journal to her chest, feeling the weight of generations of accumulated wisdom in its worn pages. Her grandmother had been known throughout the village for her knowledge of herb lore and healing, but now she understood that the old woman's education had encompassed far more than simple country remedies. Too soon, the moon reached its zenith, and the sound of hoofbeats returned to their small corner of the village. This time, the Fey warrior didn't bother with their door, simply materializing in the center of their main room like smoke given substance. He looked exactly as he had before, untouched by the cold and the wind that had whipped through the village in his absence. "It is time," he said simply, extending one clawed hand toward Elara. She rose from her chair on unsteady legs, clutching her small bundle of possessions, and trying to memorize the faces of her family one last time. Her father stood as straight as his illness would allow, pride and fear warring in his expression. Her mother's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "Remember who you are," Miran said. "Remember where you come from. No matter what they try to make you believe, you are Elara of Thornwick, daughter of Gorin and Marin, granddaughter of wise Nessa. That is not something they can take from you." Elara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She kissed each member of her family in turn, holding them close for what might be the last time, then turned to face the creature that had come to claim her. "I'm ready," she said, though she felt anything but. The warrior studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing through his silver eyes. "Are you?" he asked, and before she could respond, he reached out and grasped her wrist. The world exploded into sensation cold beyond imagining. Light that burned without warmth, the feeling of being stretched across impossible distances while somehow remaining exactly where she was. Elara felt her consciousness scatter like leaves in a hurricane, fragments of her awareness spinning away into void and starlight, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might simply cease to exist entirely. Then, gradually, sensation returned. Cold stone beneath her feet, air that tasted of snow, and something indefinably green. Light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She opened eyes she didn't remember closing, and found herself standing in a place that belonged more to dreams than to any waking world she had ever known. The hall around her stretched away in all directions, its walls crafted from what appeared to be living ice that pulsed with its own inner radiance. Pillars rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow and starlight, each one carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The floor beneath her feet was made of stones that gleamed like captured moonlight, fitted together so perfectly that she couldn't see the seams between them. But it was the occupants of the hall that truly stole her breath. Beings of impossible beauty moved through the space with the fluid grace of dancers, their forms sometimes solid and sometimes translucent, as if they existed only partially in the same reality she inhabited. Some appeared almost human, distinguished only by their ethereal perfection and the subtle points of their ears, while others bore features that belonged to no mortal creature, skin like polished stone, hair that moved like liquid silver, eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. At the far end of the hall, on a throne carved from a single massive crystal, sat a figure that commanded attention simply by existing. Even from a distance, Elara could feel the weight of ancient power that surrounded him like a visible aura, and when his gaze found her across the vast space, she felt as if she were being examined by forces beyond her purre. Comprehension. "Welcome to Veilwyn, mortal huntress," the warrior beside her said, his voice carrying easily in the crystalline acoustics of the great hall. "Welcome to the court of the Autumn King." The journey across the hall felt like walking through a dream, where the rules of distance and time held no meaning. Each step seemed to carry her further than it should have, while simultaneously feeling as if she were making no progress at all. The Fae courtiers they passed turned to watch her approach with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile, their whispered conversations creating a susurrus of sound that followed in her wake like an invisible tide. Some of them, she noticed with growing unease, bore features that reminded her strongly of the wolf she had killed, the same silver eyes, the same ethereal beauty that seemed to contain depths she couldn't begin to fathom. These watchers regarded her with particular intensity, and she began to understand that she was not just facing judgment for her actions, but entering a place where her victim had been known and valued. The Autumn King himself was a study in contrasts that made her eyes water to look upon directly. His form seemed to shift between seasons, sometimes appearing as a figure of terrible winter beauty, with skin like frost and hair like icicles, other times manifesting the rich warmth of harvest time with golden skin, and eyes like amber flames. The only constant was the power that radiated from him in waves, making the very air around his throne shimmer with barely contained energy. "Approach," he commanded, and his voice carried the sound of wind through autumn leaves and the crack of ice forming on still water. Elara found her feet moving without conscious direction, carrying her forward until she stood at the base of the crystal steps that led to his throne. "You stand accused of murder," the king continued, his gaze never leaving her face. "The slaying of Lord Silvius of the Winter Court, cousin to my blood and guardian of the sacred groves. How do you answer?" Elara's mouth felt dry as desert sand, but she forced herself to speak. "I killed a wolf," she said, her voice barely above a whisper in the vast space. "I was hunting to feed my family. I didn't know—" "Ignorance is not absolution," the king interrupted, rising from his throne with a fluid motion that sent ripples of power through the assembled court. "The old laws are clear. Life for life, blood for blood. You have taken one of ours, and the debt must be paid." A murmur ran through the assembled Fae, some nodding in agreement while others watched the proceedings with expressions that suggested this was not as simple as it appeared. Elara noticed that the warrior who had brought her here remained silent, though something in his posture suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the direction of the conversation. "However," the king continued, raising one hand to quiet the whispers, "it has been some time since a mortal has stood before this court, and Lord Silvius was unique in his habits. It is not entirely impossible that his death was indeed an accident born of ignorance rather than malice." He descended the steps slowly, each footfall ringing against the crystal like a bell, until he stood directly before her. Up close, his inhuman beauty was even more overwhelming, and Elara had to fight the urge to look away from eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies of swirling light. "Tell me, mortal child," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made him seem even more dangerous than when he had been commanding the attention of the entire court. "What would you give to save your purr?" "Life?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Elara was only beginning to understand. Around them, the court had gone silent, waiting for her response with the patient attention of predators watching their prey. "I don't understand," she said finally, though she suspected she was beginning to. The king smiled, and the expression transformed his face into something that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "Perhaps I should rephrase. What would you sacrifice to earn the right to live, to someday return to the family you claim to love so much?" Elara's mind raced, trying to understand the layers of meaning in his words. This was clearly more than a simple execution, more than the straightforward justice he had initially described. The Fae, she recalled from her grandmother's stories, were creatures of bargains and binding oaths, beings who delighted in the complexities of deals that appeared generous on the surface while concealing darker truths beneath. "What are you offering?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The king's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished pearls. "Service," he said simply. "A year and a day in my court, performing whatever tasks I deem necessary, in exchange for your life and the eventual opportunity to return to your mortal realm." "What kind of service?" "Why, kind of service?" Elara pressed, remembering her grandmother's warnings about accepting any bargain with the Fae without understanding its full implications. "Whatever I require," the king replied, his tone making it clear that he would not be more specific. "You would be bound by oath and magic to obey my commands, to serve the interests of this court as I see fit. In exchange, you would live, and at the end of your term of service, you would be free to leave." The offer seemed almost too generous, which immediately made Elara suspicious. "And if I refuse?" The king's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the great hall seemed to drop several degrees. "Then you will die here and now, as the law demands, and your family will continue to starve in their small cottage while winter slowly claims them one by one." It wasn't really a choice at all, and they both knew it. Elara thought of her brother's hollow cheeks, her father's labored breathing, her mother's hands shaking from more than cold. A year and a day seemed like an eternity, but it was better than the alternative. "I accept," she said, the words leaving her lips before she could second-guess herself. The moment the words were spoken, power surged through the hall like a living thing. The crystal walls pulsed with brighter light, and Elara felt something settle around her shoulders like an invisible cloak, the weight of binding magic that would compel her obedience for the duration of her service. "Excellent," the king said, returning to his throne with the same fluid grace he had displayed in descending. "Lord Kieran," he continued, addressing the warrior who had brought her here, "you will be responsible for our new servant's education and accommodation. See that she learns the ways of our court quickly. I have little patience for ignorance, accidental or otherwise." The warrior Kieran bowed deeply, though Elara noticed that his expression remained carefully neutral. "As you command, my lord. One more thing," the king added, his gaze finding Elara once more. "You will surrender any iron you carry. The metal is poison to our kind, and its presence in our realm is uncomfortable." Elara hesitated for a moment, thinking of the small knife her grandmother had given her, then slowly removed it from her bundle and placed it on the crystal floor. The blade seemed to dim as soon as it left her hands, as if the very air of this place was inimical to its existence. "Good," the king said, settling back onto his throne. "Your education begins now, mortal. Learn quickly, serve faithfully, and perhaps you will indeed see your family again. Disappoint me." He left the thread unfinished, but the implications were clear enough. Kieran moved to her side, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. "Come," he said quietly. "There is much you need to understand about your new circumstances." He led her from the great hall, through corridors that seemed to exist in a state of constant, subtle transformation. The walls were sometimes stone, sometimes living wood, sometimes crystal like the throne room, as if the very architecture of the place shifted according to the whims of its inhabitants. Strange light filtered down from sources she couldn't identify, casting everything in an ethereal glow that made her feel as if she were walking through a perpetual dream. "You made the only choice available to you," Kieran said as they walked, his voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry to any potential listeners. "But you should understand that the king's mercy comes with a price that extends beyond simple service." "What do you mean?" Elara asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. Kieran stopped before a door that hadn't been there a moment before, its surface carved with the same shifting patterns she had noticed throughout the palace. "Time moves differently here than in your mortal realm," he explained. "A year and a day in Valewind might be decades in your world, or it might be mere hours. The king controls the flow of time within his domain, and he is not known for his consistency in such matters." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. Her family could age and die while she served her sentence, or they could starve to death in the next few days while she remained trapped in this timeless realm. The bargain she had accepted suddenly seemed far more cruel than generous, and she understood why Kieran's expression had remained so carefully neutral during the proceedings. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. "Because," he said, placing his hand on the door's surface, "you remind me of someone I once knew, someone who made a similar bargain and paid a price far higher than she had expected." The door swung open at his touch, revealing a room beyond that was both alien and strangely welcoming. The chamber was circular, its walls curving upward to a domed ceiling that displayed what appeared to be a window into the night sky, though the constellations visible there followed no pattern Elara recognized from her mortal world. Soft light emanated from crystals embedded in the walls, casting everything in a gentle blue-white glow that reminded her of moonlight on snow. The furnishings were sparse but elegant, a bed that seemed to be carved from a single piece of pale wood, a small table and chair, and a wardrobe that stood open to reveal clothing that shimmered with its own inner light. "This will be your room for the duration of your service," Kieran said, stepping aside to let her enter. "The clothes will fit you perfectly, as will everything else you might need. The magic of this place adapts to its inhabitants, though I would advise against becoming too comfortable with such luxuries." Elara moved into the room slowly, her fingers trailing along the smooth surface of the wooden bed. The grain of the wood seemed to pulse beneath her touch, as if it were still alive and growing, and she jerked her hand back with a gasp. "Everything here is alive in some way," Kieran explained, noticing her reaction. "The palace itself is a living entity, grown rather than built, and it responds to the emotions and needs of those who dwell within it. It will provide for your physical needs, but it will also watch you, learn from you, and report back to the king if you do anything he considers unwise." The weight of constant surveillance settled over her like a heavy blanket, adding another layer to the prison she had walked into. She moved to the window that wasn't quite a window, staring up at the alien stars and wondering if her family was looking at the same sky from their small cottage in Thornwick. "How long have you been here?" she asked, not turning away from the impossible view. "Long enough to understand the rules," Kieran replied, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of experiences she couldn't imagine. "Long enough to know that survival here requires more than just obedience. You must learn to think like they do, to understand the layers of meaning beneath every word and gesture. The Fae do not lie, but they are masters of selective truth." Elara turned to face him, studying the sharp planes of his face and the way the crystal light played across his features. Up close, away from the overwhelming presence of the Autumn King, she could see that he was different from the other Fae she had encountered. His beauty was more earthbound, less ethereal, and there was something in his eyes that reminded her of home. "You're not entirely Fae, are you?" she said, the realization hitting her with sudden clarity. Kieran's expression flickered, surprise and something that might have been approval crossing his features before he could hide them. "You're more perceptive than most mortals who find their way here," he said. "My mother was human, taken by the Winter Court during a particularly harsh winter decades ago. I am what some might call a changeling, though that term carries connotations that don't entirely apply to my situation." "And your father?" "A lord of the Winter Court, cousin to the one you killed." Kieran's silver eyes met hers directly, and she saw no anger there, only a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't entirely decipher. "Which makes this situation rather more complicated than it might otherwise be." Elara felt her knees weaken, and she sank onto the edge of the bed that felt disturbingly warm beneath her. "You're related to the wolf I killed." "Silvius was my cousin, yes, though we were never particularly close. He spent most of his time in the mortal realm, fascinated by your kind in ways that many of the court found unseemly." Kieran moved to the small table, running his fingers along its surface in what appeared to be a nervous gesture. "He was known for taking animal form and wandering through your forests, observing mortal life from a distance." "Then why didn't you speak against me? Why didn't you demand justice?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something beyond the curved walls of her chamber. "Because," he said finally, "I have seen what passes for justice in this court, and I have learned that there are worse fates than death. The king's offer of service is not the mercy it appears to be. The chill that ran down Elara's spine had nothing to do with the temperature of the room." "What do you mean?" "Those who serve the Autumn King do not simply perform menial tasks," Kieran explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They become part of his collection, mortal souls bound to his will and shaped by his desires. Some become warriors, others become entertainers, still others become other things. The magic that binds you will not simply compel obedience, it will gradually change you, make you more like us and less like yourself." Elara's hand went instinctively to the silver pendant at her throat, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. To her surprise, it had grown warm again, almost hot against her skin, and she could feel a subtle vibration running through the metal as if it were resonating with some unseen force. "Your pendant," Kieran said, his eyes widening as he noticed her gesture. "Where did you get it?" "It was my grandmother's," Elara replied, pulling the chain from beneath her shirt to show him the carved metal disc. "She said it would protect me, though I'm not sure how much good it's doing me now." Kieran stepped closer, his expression intent as he studied the pendant without touching it. "May I?" he asked, extending one hand toward the silver disc. Elara nodded, lifting the chain over her head and placing it in his palm. The moment the metal touched his skin, he hissed in pain and nearly dropped it, his fingers jerking back as if he had been burned. "Iron," he said, his voice filled with wonder and something that might have been hope. "There's iron worked into the silver, hidden so cunningly that even the king's magic couldn't detect it during your arrival. Your grandmother was far more than she appeared to be." "What does that mean?" Elara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "It means," Kieran said, carefully handing the pendant back to her, "that you are not as helpless as you appear. Iron disrupts fey magic, breaks our spells and bindings. If you're clever about how you use it, that pendant might be the key to surviving your year of service with your soul intact." Elara slipped the chain back over her head, feeling the pendant settle against her chest like a warm weight of possibility. For the first time since she had stepped into this impossible realm, she felt something other than despair. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "If the king discovers that you've told me about the pendant, about what really happens to his servants, then I will face whatever punishment he deems appropriate," Kieran finished. "But I have watched too many mortals lose themselves to his magic, seen too many bright souls dimmed by his influence. Perhaps it's time someone fought back." A sound from the corridor beyond interrupted their conversation footsteps that rang against the crystal floors with a rhythm that spoke of approaching authority. Kieran moved swiftly to the door, his posture straightening into the formal bearing she had seen him display in the throne room. "Remember," he said quietly, "trust no one completely, not even me. The magic of this place makes secrets difficult to keep, and loyalties here are as changeable as the seasons. But if you truly wish to see your family again, you must learn to play their games better than they do." The door opened to admit a figure that made Elara's breath catch in her throat. The woman who entered was tall and elegant, her beauty so perfect it seemed almost mathematical in its precision. Her hair fell in waves of deep autumn colors, gold and crimson. Burnished Kapantha eyes held the deep green of forest depths. She moved with the fluid grace that all the Fae seemed to possess, but there was something about her that suggested danger barely held in check. "Lady Morwen," Kieran said, bowing deeply, "to what do we owe the honor?" "The king has decided that our new servant should begin her education immediately," the woman replied, her voice carrying the sound of wind through leaves and the distant call of hunting horns. "I am to assess her abilities and determine the most appropriate use for her talents." Her gaze settled on Elara with an intensity that made her skin crawl. There was something predatory in the way the Fae woman studied her, as if she were cataloging weaknesses and planning how best to exploit them. "Stand," Lady Morwen commanded, and Elara found herself obeying before she could consciously decide to do so. The compulsion was subtle but undeniable, woven into the magic that bound her to the king's service. "Turn around," came the next order, and again her body moved without her permission. She could feel the woman's gaze traveling over her like a physical touch, examining every aspect of her appearance and bearing. "Interesting," Lady Morwen murmured. "She has the look of the wild about her, the bearing of one who has lived close to the earth. That could be useful for certain tasks. And there's something else." Her eyes narrowed as she studied Elara's face. Something familiar about her features. "Tell me, mortal, what was your grandmother's name?" "Nessa," Elara replied, the word leaving her lips before she could consider whether it was wise to answer. Lady Morwen's expression shifted, surprise and something that might have been recognition flickering across her perfect features. "Nessa of Thornwick," she said slowly. "Yes, I remember her. She was quite remarkable for a mortal. possessed of knowledge that few of your kind ever acquire. How curious that her granddaughter should find her way to our court." "You knew my grandmother?" Elara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Knew her? Child, I was the one who taught her." Lady Morwen's smile was sharp as a blade. Many years ago, when the barriers between our worlds were thinner, she sought out forbidden knowledge and was willing to pay the price for it. "I wonder if you inherited her particular talents." The implications of the woman's words settled over Elara like a cold shroud. Her grandmother had dealt with the Fae, had learned their secrets and paid whatever price such knowledge demanded. It explained so much: the pendant, the stories, the warnings that had always seemed more urgent than simple folklore. "What kind of talents?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be something she didn't want to hear. "Magic," Lady Morwen said simply. "The ability to see beyond the veil that separates the worlds, to work with forces that most mortals cannot even perceive. Your grandmother was quite gifted in such matters, though she was wise enough to use her abilities sparingly." The woman began to circle Elara slowly, her movements predatory and calculating. "The question is whether that gift has been passed down to you. If it has, then your service to the king could be far more interesting than either of us initially anticipated." "I'm not magical," Elara protested, though even as the words left her lips, she thought of the pendant's strange warmth, the way it had grown hot whenever she was in danger. "Are you not?" Lady Morwen asked, extending one perfectly manicured hand toward Elara's face. "Then explain this." Power flowed from the Fae woman's fingers, visible as streams of golden light that reached toward Elara's skin. But instead of touching her, the light stopped inches away, as if blocked by an invisible barrier. The pendant at Elara's throat grew burning hot, and for a moment she could see threads of silver light radiating from it, forming a protective web around her body. Lady Morwen stepped back, her expression shifting to one of genuine interest. "How fascinating! The iron in your pendant is not simply disrupting our magic, it's channeling your own power, amplifying abilities you didn't even know you possessed." "I don't understand," Elara said, though she was beginning to suspect that her grandmother's final gift had been far more than a simple piece of jewelry. "Your grandmother was cleverer than I gave her credit for," Lady Morwen mused. "She's given you a weapon disguised as protection, a tool that could make you far more dangerous than any of us realized. The king will be very interested to learn of this development." "Please," Elara said, instinctively, reaching for the pendant. "Don't tell him. I don't even know how to use whatever this is." Lady Morwen studied her for a long moment, her green eyes calculating. "Perhaps," she said finally, "that could be arranged, but such discretion would require compensation." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Elara was only beginning to understand. She glanced toward Kieran, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "What kind of compensation?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be something unpleasant. "Service of a more personal nature," Lady Morwen replied, her smile sharp and predatory. "I have need of someone with your particular combination of abilities and malleability. Serve me faithfully, and I will ensure that the king remains unaware of your true potential. Refuse, and I will inform him immediately of what I have discovered here." It was another bargain, another layer of obligation piled onto the debt she already owed. But as Elara looked into the Fae woman's eyes, she realized that she had no choice but to accept. The alternative was to face whatever the Autumn King might demand if he learned of her hidden abilities, and she suspected that would be far worse than whatever Lady Morwen had in mind. "I accept," she said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Excellent," Lady Morwen said, clapping her hands together in apparent delight. "Your first task will be to accompany me to the Winter Court tomorrow. There are certain negotiations that require a delicate touch, and I believe your presence could be quite useful." The Winter Court. Kieran spoke for the first time since Lady Morwen's arrival, his voice carefully controlled but edged with something that might have been concern. "Yes, Lord Kieran. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining good relations with our cousins in the Winter Realm, particularly given recent events." Lady Morwen's gaze flicked meaningfully toward Elara. "Besides, it will be educational for our new servant to see how business is conducted between the courts." The Fey woman moved toward the door, pausing only to look back at Elara with an expression that was both warning and promise. "Rest well tonight, mortal. Tomorrow you will begin to understand the true nature of the bargain you have made." After she left, the room fell into a silence that seemed to press against Elara's ears like a physical weight. Kieran remained by the door, his posture tense and his expression troubled, while she sank back onto the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had just occurred. "The Winter Court," she said finally. "That's where the wolf-were Sylvius came from, isn't it?" "Yes," Kieran replied, his voice quiet. "And Lady Morwen's interest in taking you there is not coincidental. The Winter Court will want to see the mortal who killed one of their own, and their idea of justice may be very different from the king's." "You think she's planning to hand me over to them?" "I think Lady Morwen rarely does anything without multiple motives, and few of them are benevolent." Kieran moved away from the door, coming to stand before the window that showed the alien stars. "She was telling the truth about knowing your grandmother, though. Nessa of Thornwick was legend among those who traffic with the Fae. It was said she could walk between worlds without losing herself, could bargain with our kind and emerge with her soul intact. And now I'm supposed to follow in her footsteps." Elara laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I don't know anything about magic or bargains or walking between worlds. I'm just a huntress from a small village who made a terrible mistake." "Perhaps," Kieran said, turning to look at her with those strange silver eyes. "Or perhaps you're exactly what your grandmother intended you to be. The pendant she gave you wasn't just protection, it was preparation. She knew this day would come, and she made sure you would have the tools to survive it." Elara fingered the silver disc at her throat, feeling the warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "How do I use it? How do I access whatever power she left me?" "Carefully," Kieran replied. "The magic your grandmother worked into that pendant is subtle but powerful. It will amplify your natural abilities, but only if you learn to trust your instincts and stop fighting against what you are." "And what am I?" "That," Kieran said with something that might have been a smile, "is something you'll have to discover for yourself. But I suspect you're far more than any of us realize, including yourself." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the crystal handle. "Tomorrow will be dangerous," he said without looking back. "The Winter Court has its own customs and its own justice. Whatever Lady Morwen is planning, you'll need to be ready for anything." "Will you be there?" Elara asked, surprised by how much the answer mattered to her. "I will try," he replied. "But remember what I told you, trust no one completely. The Fae are masters of deception, and even those who seem to be helping you may have their own agendas." After he left, Elara found herself alone in the strange room with its living walls and alien stars. She moved to the wardrobe and examined the clothes that waited there, garments that seemed to be woven from moonlight and shadow. When she touched them, they shifted to accommodate her size and shape, adapting to her form as if they were made from liquid rather than fabric. She selected a simple dress that reminded her of the deep blue of twilight, marveling at the way the material seemed to flow like water over her skin. The mirror that stood beside the wardrobe showed her a reflection that was still recognizably herself, but somehow enhanced, as if the magic of this place was already beginning to work its changes upon her. The thought sent a chill through her, remembering Kieran's warnings about the king's servants and what they eventually became. She touched the pendant at her throat, drawing comfort from its warmth and the promise of protection it represented. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever trials awaited her in the winter court, she would face them as herself Elara of Thornwick, granddaughter of wise Nessa, huntress and protector of her family. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams of silver eyes and moonlit forests, of bargains made and prices paid, of power that flowed like water through her veins, and magic that sang in her blood. In her dreams, she stood in a place between worlds, balanced on the edge of possibilities she had never imagined, while voices whispered secrets in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. When she woke, the alien stars in her ceiling had shifted to show what might have been dawn, though the light that filled her room came from no sun she had ever known. The clothes she had worn the night before had been replaced by traveling garments that seemed designed for both elegance and practicality. A dress of deep green that moved like living leaves, boots that felt as comfortable as if she had worn them for years, and a cloak that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Lady Morwen arrived as she was finishing her breakfast, which had appeared on the small table without her requesting it. The Fey woman looked even more dangerous in the strange light of the Valewind dawn, her beauty sharp-edged and predatory, her smile holding promises that Elara suspected she didn't want fulfilled. "Are you ready for your education to truly begin?" Lady Morwen asked, extending one perfect hand toward the door. Elara rose from her chair, the pendant at her throat pulsing with warmth, and her grandmother's journal tucked safely in an inner pocket of her cloak. "I'm ready," she said, though she felt anything but. "Excellent," Lady Morwen replied, her smile growing wider. "Then let us see what the Winter Court makes of Nessa's granddaughter." The journey to the Winter Court began in the same throne room where Elara had first encountered the Autumn King, though the great hall looked different in the strange light of the Valewind dawn. The crystal walls seemed to pulse with their own inner fire, and the assembled courtiers moved through the space like figures from a fever dream, their forms shifting between solid and translucent as they went about their incomprehensible business. The Autumn King himself was absent from his throne, though his presence seemed to linger in the air like an echo of power. In his place stood a figure that Elara didn't recognize, a Fey woman, whose beauty was so alien it made her eyes water to look upon directly. Her skin had the pale translucence of carved jade, and her hair fell in waves that seemed to contain actual starlight, while her eyes held depths that suggested she had seen the birth and death of worlds. "Lady Morwen," the woman said, her voice carrying the sound of distant thunder and the whisper of wind through vast spaces. "I trust our guest is prepared for the journey ahead? As prepared as any mortal can be for their first visit to the Winter Court," Lady Morwen replied, though there was something in her tone that suggested she found the idea amusing rather than concerning. The woman's gaze settled on Elara with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You are the one who killed Lord Silvius," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I am," Elara replied, forcing herself to meet those alien eyes directly. "Interesting. You look remarkably like your grandmother did when she first came to our attention. I wonder if you inherited more than just her appearance." The woman smiled, and the expression held all the warmth of winter starlight. I am Lady Nahara, speaker for the Autumn King in matters concerning the Winter Court. I will be accompanying you on this journey." The announcement sent a chill through Elara that had nothing to do with the temperature of the Great Hall. If the Autumn King was sending his personal representative to the Winter Court, then whatever was planned was far more significant than a simple diplomatic visit. "The portal is prepared," Lady Nahara continued, gesturing toward what appeared to be empty air near the far wall of the hall. As she spoke, the space began to shimmer and twist, revealing a doorway that seemed to open onto a landscape of eternal winter. Through the portal, Elara could see a realm of crystalline beauty that made Valewind seem warm and welcoming by comparison. Snow fell in steady sheets across a landscape of ice-covered trees and frozen streams, while in the distance, spires of what appeared to be solid ice rose toward a sky the color of old pewter. "The Winter Court," Lady Morwen said, noting Elara's expression, "where the cold is not merely a season, but a way of being, and where justice is as sharp and unforgiving as the wind that blows across the frozen wastes." They stepped through the portal together, the three of them moving from the warm crystal light of Valewind into a cold so intense it seemed to burn. Elara's breath came out in clouds of vapor that froze almost instantly, and she was grateful for the magical clothing that seemed to adjust to the temperature without her conscious direction. The landscape around them was both beautiful and terrible, a frozen wilderness that stretched as far as the eye could see. The trees were works of art carved from ice and snow, their branches holding a delicate tracery that caught and reflected the pale light that filtered down from the overcast sky. In the distance, she could see the spires she had glimpsed through the portal, rising like frozen flames toward the heavens. "The Palace of Eternal Winter," Lady Nahara explained, following her gaze. "Seat of the Winter Court and home to Queen Elara, the Frost Sovereign. It is said that the palace was carved from a single massive glacier by the Queen herself, shaped by will and magic into a dwelling worthy of her power." They began walking toward the distant spires, their feet crunching through snow that never seemed to melt or compact under their weight. The cold was unlike anything Elara had ever experienced, a living thing that sought to steal the warmth from her body and the breath from her lungs. Only the pendant at her throat kept her from succumbing to it entirely, its warmth radiating outward to create a small sphere of protection around her. "Tell me," Lady Morwen said as they walked, her voice carrying easily in the thin air, "what do you know of the customs of the Winter Court?" "Nothing," Elara admitted, though she suspected that was about to change. "They are a people of absolutes," Lady Nahara explained. "Where the Autumn Court prizes subtlety and complexity, the Winter Court values directness and clarity. They do not engage in the elaborate wordplay that characterizes much of Fae interaction. When they speak, they mean exactly what they say, no more and no less." "That sounds almost refreshing," Elara said, thinking of the layers of meaning and hidden implications that seemed to characterize every conversation she had had since arriving in Valewind. "Do not mistake simplicity for kindness," Lady Morwen warned. "The Winter Court's directness can be more dangerous than any subtle manipulation. They will tell you exactly what they intend to do to you, and then they will do it without hesitation or mercy." The palace grew larger as they approached, revealing details that defied both architecture and imagination. The walls were indeed carved from solid ice, but it was ice that held its own light, glowing with an inner radiance that turned the entire structure into a beacon visible for miles across the frozen landscape. Towers rose in impossible spirals, connected by bridges that seemed to be made of crystallized air, while windows that appeared to be cut from single sheets of diamond reflected the pale light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Guards stood at the massive gates. Figures that might once have been human, but had been transformed by the cold into something else entirely. Their skin had the blue-white pallor of deep frost, and their eyes were chips of ice that reflected no warmth or mercy. They wore armor that seemed to be carved from the same glacial ice as the palace itself, and they carried weapons that glowed with their own inner cold. "State your business," one of the guards commanded, his voice carrying the sound of ice cracking under pressure. "Lady Morwen of the Autumn Court," Lady Morwen replied, her tone formal and precise. "I come at the invitation of Queen Elara, accompanied by Lady Nahara, speaker for the Autumn King, and a mortal servant bound to our court service." The guard's gaze settled on Elara with an intensity that made her grateful for the pendant's protection. "The mortal who killed Lord Silvius," he said, and again it wasn't quite a question. "The same," Lady Nahara confirmed. "The Queen awaits you in the Hall of Judgment," the guard said, stepping aside to allow them passage. "You are expected." The interior of the palace was even more magnificent than its exterior, a maze of corridors and chambers that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual winter. Ice formed the walls, floors, and ceilings, but it was ice that had been shaped and carved with such skill that it resembled the finest stonework. Tapestries hung from the walls, woven from what appeared to be frozen mist, and depicting scenes of winter hunts and ancient battles fought across landscapes of eternal snow. Their footsteps echoed in the crystalline corridors as they made their way deeper into the palace, passing chambers where the business of the winter court was conducted by beings of terrible beauty and inhuman grace. Some looked almost human, distinguished only by their pale skin and the frost that seemed to cling to their breath, while others bore features that belonged to no mortal creature skin, like polished ice, hair that moved like wind-blown snow, eyes that held the deep blue of glacial crevasses. The Hall of Judgment was a vast chamber at the heart of the palace, its domed ceiling rising to dizzying heights, and its walls carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light. At the far end of the hall, on a throne carved from what appeared to be a single massive diamond, sat the most beautiful and terrible being Elara had ever encountered. Queen Elara of the Winter Court was winter given form and consciousness. Beauty so perfect it transcended mortal understanding and entered the realm of the sublime. Her skin had the translucent quality of new ice, and her hair fell in waves that seemed to contain actual snowflakes, never melting despite the warmth that should have been generated by her body. Her eyes were the deep blue of winter skies, and when she looked at Elara, it felt as if she were being examined by the personification of the season itself. "Approach," the queen commanded, her voice carrying the sound of wind through icicles and the distant crash of avalanches. The power in that single word was so overwhelming that Elara found herself walking forward before she could consciously decide to obey, her feet carrying her across the polished ice floor until she stood at the base of the crystal steps that led to the throne. "You stand before the Queen of Winter," Lady Nahara announced, her voice formal and precise. "Show the proper respect." Elara sank into the deepest curtsy she could manage, her head bowed and her eyes fixed on the floor. The cold radiating from the throne was so intense that she could feel ice crystals forming in her hair, and only the pendant's warmth kept her from being frozen solid where she stood. "Rise," Queen Elara said, and Elara straightened slowly, forcing herself to meet those impossible blue eyes. "So, you are the mortal who took the life of my cousin." "I am, Your Majesty," Elara replied, her voice barely above a whisper in the vast space. "And you claim ignorance of his true nature." "I do, Your Majesty. I thought I was hunting a wolf to feed my family." The queen studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Silvius was indeed in wolf form when you killed him," she said finally. "It was a shape he favored when walking in your realm, though he should have been more careful about revealing himself to mortal hunters." Something in the Queen's tone suggested that this was not entirely unexpected news, and Elara felt a flicker of hope that perhaps the Winter Court's justice might be more merciful than she had feared. "However," the Queen continued, and that flicker of hope died as quickly as it had been born, "ignorance does not absolve you of guilt. You took the life of one who was under my protection, and that debt must be acknowledged. The Autumn King has already claimed her service," Lady Morwen interjected, speaking for the first time since they had entered the hall. "She is bound to our court for a year and a day." "Yes," Queen Lysara said, her gaze shifting to Lady Morwen with an expression that might have been amusement. "I am aware of the bargain she made with my brother, but the Winter Court has its own claims to consider." The Queen rose from her throne with a fluid motion that sent ripples of cold through the hall, and Elara could feel the temperature drop even further as the Winter Sovereign descended the crystal steps. Up close, her beauty was even more overwhelming, and Elara had to fight the urge to look away from features that seemed too perfect to be real. "Tell me, mortal," the Queen said, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made her seem even more dangerous. "What do you know of the bond between cousins in the Winter Court?" "Nothing, Your Majesty," Elara admitted, though she suspected she was about to learn something unpleasant. "When one of our blood is taken from us, the loss creates a wound in the fabric of our realm that must be healed. The traditional method is to claim the life of the one responsible, but in this case, your death would not serve to restore what was lost." The Queen began to circle Elara slowly, her movements predatory and calculating. "Silvius was unique among our kind, possessing abilities that made him particularly valuable to the Winter Court. He could walk between worlds without losing himself, could take any form he chose, and could see through the veils that separate mortal and fae. Such gifts are rare and precious, and they cannot be easily replaced." "I don't understand," Elara said, though she was beginning to suspect she did. "Don't you?" The Queen's smile was sharp as winter wind. "You carry the blood of one who trafficked with our kind, who learned our secrets and paid our prices. You wear a pendant that channels power you don't understand, and you've already begun to change in ways you haven't yet recognized. Perhaps the loss of one gifted individual could be balanced by the gain of another." The implication hit Elara like a physical blow. The Winter Court wasn't interested in her death. They wanted to transform her into a replacement for the cousin she had killed, to turn her into another shape-shifting spy who could move between the mortal and fae realms. "The Autumn King's claim takes precedence," Lady Nahara said, her voice carefully neutral. "The mortal is bound to our court's service." "For now," Queen Lysara agreed. "But when that service ends, she will come to us. We will complete the transformation that has already begun, and she will take Silvius's place as our agent in the mortal realm." The word settled over Elara like a death sentence, binding her future to a fate she had never chosen. Not only was she trapped in service to the Autumn King for a year and a day, but even if she survived that ordeal, she would face an eternity as a creature of the Winter Court, transformed beyond recognition and forever, separated from her humanity. "That seems excessive," Lady Morwen said carefully, though there was something in her tone that suggested she found the development interesting rather than concerning. "Does it?" Queen Lysara returned to her throne, settling onto the crystal seat with a grace that made the air itself seem to shimmer. "A life was taken from us, one whose abilities were unique and irreplaceable. Justice demands compensation, and transformation is kinder than death. And if I refuse? Elara found herself asking, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The queen's smile was beautiful and terrible as winter starlight. Then you will discover what the Winter Court considers appropriate punishment for those who spill our blood and show no proper contrition. I assure you, mortal, the transformation I offer is far more merciful than the Maul. Alternatives. Elara's hand went instinctively to the pendant at her throat, feeling its warmth pulse against her skin like a heartbeat. Her grandmother's journal pressed against her ribs from its hiding place in her cloak, and she found herself wondering what wisdom might be contained in those pages, what knowledge Nessa had accumulated during her own dealings with the Fae. However, Queen Lasara continued, I am not entirely unreasonable. You will have the duration of your service to the Autumn King to adjust to the idea. Perhaps you will even come to see it as an opportunity rather than a punishment. After all, how many mortals are offered the chance to transcend the limitations of their brief existence? Your Majesty is most gracious, Lady Nahara said, though her tone suggested the words tasted like ash. We will, of course, ensure that the mortal understands the honor being offered to her. See that you do, the Queen replied. And, Lady Morwen, I trust you will remember that the mortal is not to be damaged beyond repair during her service. We will have need of her in relatively intact condition when the time comes for her transformation. Of course, Your Majesty, Lady Morwen said, inclining her head in what might have been respect or mockery. I would never dream of interfering with the Winter Court's plans. The audience was clearly at an end, though Elara felt as if her entire world had shifted beneath her feet. What had begun as a simple hunting trip to feed her family had now become a web of obligations and debts that seemed to grow more complex with each passing hour. She was bound to serve the Autumn King, compelled to obey Lady Morwen's commands, and destined to eventually become property of the Winter Court. As they made their way back through the crystalline corridors of the palace, Elara found herself struggling to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The cold seemed more bitter now, seeping through even the magical protection of her clothing and the pendant's warmth, as if the very air was trying to claim her for the transformation that awaited. You're taking this rather well, Lady Morwen observed, as they emerged from the palace into the frozen landscape beyond. Most mortals would be weeping or raging by now. Would it change anything? Elara asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Not in the slightest, Lady Nahara replied. The Queen's word is as immutable as winter itself. Once spoken, her decrees cannot be altered or revoked. Then tears would be wasted effort, Elara said, though inside she felt as if something vital had been torn away from her. The hope of returning to her family, of resuming her life in the mortal realm, had been nothing more than an illusion. Even if she survived her service to the Autumn King, she would never again be the person who had walked into the forest that morning to hunt for food. The journey back to Valewind passed in contemplative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts as they traversed the frozen wasteland that surrounded the Winter Court's domain. The portal that would return them to the Autumn Realm stood open in a grove of ice-covered trees, its edges shimmering with barely contained power. Before we return, Lady Morwen said, pausing at the threshold between realms, there is something you should understand about your situation. The Queen spoke truly when she said that transformation had already begun. The magic of our realm has been working on you since the moment you arrived. But the process is not inevitable. Not yet. Elara turned to look at her, hope flickering to life despite her efforts to suppress it. What do you mean? The pendant you wear, The one your grandmother crafted with such care does more than simply protect you from our magic. It preserves your essential nature, prevents the changes from taking hold too deeply." Lady Morwen's expression was unreadable as she studied Elara's face. With the right knowledge, the right preparation, it might be possible to resist the transformation entirely. "And you would help me do this?" Elara asked, though she suspected such assistance would come with a price. "Perhaps," Lady Morwen replied. "But such aid would require absolute loyalty, complete obedience to my commands. The Queen expects to claim you at the end of your service to the Autumn King, and disappointing the Winter Court is not something to be undertaken lightly. Another bargain, another layer of obligation and debt." Elara was beginning to understand why Kieran had warned her about the complexity of Fae politics. Every offer of help came with strings attached. Every alliance carried the potential for betrayal. "I'll consider your offer," she said finally, though she suspected she had little choice in the matter. "See that you do," Lady Morwen replied, stepping through the portal with Lady Nahara close behind. "Your time grows short, mortal. Soon you will have to choose between transformation and rebellion, and that choice will determine whether you see your family again or spend eternity as a creature of the Winter Court." The return to Valewen felt like waking from a nightmare into a dream that was only marginally less disturbing. The crystal halls of the Autumn King's palace seemed warm and welcoming after the harsh beauty of the Winter Court, though Elara knew that such comfort was an illusion designed to make her more compliant. Her room had been prepared for her return, the bed turned down, and a meal waiting on the small table. But instead of eating, she moved to the window that showed the alien stars and pulled her grandmother's journal from its hiding place in her cloak. The leather binding was worn soft with age, and the pages crackled as she opened them to reveal her grandmother's careful handwriting. The first entry was dated 40 years ago, when Nessa would have been little older than Elara was now. The writing was young and eager, full of excitement about the mysteries she was beginning to uncover. But as Elara read further, she could see how the tone changed over the years, becoming more cautious and more aware of the prices that knowledge demanded. "The Fae do not lie, but they are masters of selective truth," one entry read. "They will tell you exactly what they intend to do, but they will not tell you what it means or what the consequences will be. Always listen for what is not said as much as what is." Another passage caught her attention. "The pendant grows stronger with each generation, absorbing power from those who wear it and passing that strength on to their descendants. It is both anchor and amplifier, keeping the wearer grounded in their true nature while enhancing their natural abilities. But it requires conscious will to activate fully. The magic responds to intent and necessity, not passive hope." Elara touched the silver disc at her throat, trying to understand what her grandmother meant by conscious will. The pendant had grown warm whenever she was in danger, had protected her from Lady Morwen's magic, but she had no idea how to control or direct its power. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reading. She quickly closed the journal and tucked it back into her cloak before calling out for the visitor to enter. To her surprise, it was Kieran who stepped into the room, his expression troubled and his posture tense. "How did your visit to the Winter Court proceed?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be unpleasant. "About as well as could be expected," Elara replied, settling onto the edge of her bed. "Queen Lasara has decided that I'm to be transformed into a replacement for the cousin I killed. After my service to the Autumn King ends, I'll belong to the Winter Court." Kieran's expression darkened, and for a moment she saw something that looked like genuine anger flash through his silver eyes. "The queen wastes no time in claiming what she considers hers," he said, "though I suspect Lady Morwen encouraged such a decision." "Why would she do that?" "Because it gives her leverage over you," Kieran explained, moving to stand beside the window. "As long as the threat of transformation looms over you, she can extract whatever service she desires by offering protection that may or may not be real. She said she could help me resist the change, that the pendant my grandmother gave me might be enough to preserve my humanity." "She may be telling the truth," Kieran said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Your grandmother's magic was legendary, and if anyone could craft a protection that would last beyond death, it would be her. But trusting Lady Morwen to honor any bargain you make is unwise." Elara rose from the bed and moved to join him at the window, staring out at the alien constellations that wheeled overhead. "What would you do?" she asked. "If you were in my position, what choice would you make?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the crystal walls. "I would fight," he said finally. "Not because I believed I could win, but because the alternative is to lose everything that makes me who I am. Better to die as yourself than live as something else's creation. Even if it meant never seeing my family again?" "Even then," he replied, though his voice carried a sadness that suggested the words cost him something to speak. "The Fae you would become after transformation would remember your family, might even feel something like love for them, but it wouldn't be you anymore. It would be a beautiful, terrible thing wearing your memories like jewelry." The image sent a chill through Elara that had nothing to do with temperature. She thought of her brother's laugh, her mother's fierce protectiveness, her father's quiet strength, and realized that Kieran was right. A transformed version of herself might visit them, might even care for them in some fashion, but it would be a hollow mockery of the daughter and sister they had known. "Then I'll fight," she said, the words carrying more conviction than she felt. "I'll find a way to break free of all these bargains and debts, and I'll go home to my family." "Good," Kieran said, and when he smiled, it transformed his face entirely. "Now we just need to figure out how to accomplish the impossible." Before Elara could respond, the air in her room began to shimmer with the same ethereal light she had seen during her first encounter with the Autumn King. Power gathered around them, making her skin tingle and her teeth ache, and she realized that someone was coming who possessed authority enough to bend the very fabric of the realm to their will. The light coalesced into a familiar figure, Lady Morwen, her beauty sharp and predatory in the crystal illumination of the room. But she was not alone. Behind her stood another Fae, one whose presence seemed to draw the warmth from the air and the light from the walls. "Lord Kieran," Lady Morwen said, her voice carrying the sound of wind through autumn leaves. "How convenient to find you here. The king wishes to speak with you both." The Fae who accompanied her stepped forward, and Elara felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized him. He was tall and elegant, his beauty terrible in its perfection, and his eyes held the same silver depth she had seen in the wolf she had killed. But where Sylvius had possessed a wild nobility, this being radiated cold authority and barely controlled fury. "Lord Thane," Kieran said, his voice carefully neutral, though she could see tension in every line of his body. "I wasn't aware you had arrived from the Winter Court." "I came as soon as I received word of my brother's death," Thane replied, his gaze settling on Elara with an intensity that made her wish she could disappear entirely. "I wanted to see for myself the mortal who dared to spill royal blood." "Brother." The word hit Elara like a physical blow. She had not just killed a cousin of the Winter Court, she had killed the brother of one of the most powerful lords in the Fae realm. The silver eyes that studied her held depths of grief and rage that made Queen Lysara's cold judgment seem merciful by comparison. "You have the look of a hunter," Thane continued, beginning to circle her slowly. "I can see why my brother might have been careless around you. Silvius always did have a weakness for mortal women with steel in their spines." "My lord," Lady Morwen interjected carefully, "the king awaits." "Yes," Thane said, though his gaze never left Elara's face. "Let us see what justice the Autumn King has in mind for the mortal who orphaned the Winter Court." The journey through the crystal corridors felt like a march to execution. Thane walked beside Elara, his presence radiating cold that made her grateful for the pendant's protection, while Kieran and Lady Morwen flanked them like guards escorting a prisoner. Other fae they passed in the halls stopped to stare, their whispered conversations creating a susurrus of sound that followed in their wake. The throne room had been transformed since her last visit. The crystal walls now pulsed with darker light, and the air itself seemed thick with power that made breathing difficult. The Autumn King sat upon his throne like a figure carved from living shadow, his beauty terrible and magnificent in the shifting illumination. "Approach," he commanded, and Elara found herself obeying before she could consciously decide to move. The compulsion was stronger now, woven into the very air around the throne, and she realized that her binding to his service had deepened since her visit to the Winter Court. "Lord Thane," the king said, inclining his head slightly in acknowledgement, "I trust your sister received my message regarding the mortal's fate?" "She did," Thane replied, his voice carrying the sound of wind across frozen wastes. "And she has made her desires clear. The mortal will serve you for the agreed term, then come to us for transformation. It is a just and measured response to the loss we have suffered." "Indeed," the king agreed, though something in his tone suggested he found the situation more complex than his words indicated. "However, there have been developments that may affect our arrangement." He gestured toward Lady Morwen, who stepped forward with a grace that spoke of long practice in court politics. "Your Majesty, as requested, I have assessed the mortal's capabilities and discovered something quite remarkable." "Proceed," the king commanded. "She carries her grandmother's gift," Lady Morwen said, her voice carrying clearly in the crystalline acoustics of the great hall, the ability to work with forces that bridge the gap between mortal and fae. "With proper training, she could become quite useful to our court." "How useful?" the king asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Useful enough to serve as an agent in the mortal realm, moving between worlds without detection and gathering information that would be difficult to obtain through other means." Lady Morwen's smile was sharp as a blade. "The Winter Court is not the only realm that could benefit from such abilities." A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers, and Elara realized that she was being discussed like a prize to be won, rather than a person with her own desires and agency. The various fae courts were apparently more interested in what she could do for them than in any concept of justice or mercy. "An interesting proposition," Thane said, his silver eyes narrowing as he studied Elara with renewed attention. "But the Winter Court's claim takes precedence. Silvius was my brother, and his death created a debt that must be paid in kind." "Of course," the king replied smoothly. "But perhaps there is a way to satisfy both courts' interests while also providing our mortal guest with an opportunity to demonstrate her true loyalties." The way he said the word guest made it clear that Elara's status was anything but voluntary, though she supposed that in the complex hierarchy of fae politics, servant was probably a step up from prisoner or prawa. "Sacrifice. What do you propose?" Thane asked, though his tone suggested he was not entirely receptive to negotiation. "A test," the king said, rising from his throne with the fluid grace that all the Fae seemed to possess. "Let the mortal prove her worth to both courts. If she succeeds, she may earn the right to choose her own fate. If she fails, she dies," Thane finished, his voice carrying the finality of winter's grip. "And my brother's death is properly avenged." "Agreed," the king said, though he didn't bother to ask for Elara's opinion on the matter. "The test will take place in 3 days' time, which should provide sufficient opportunity for our guest to prepare herself." "What kind of test?" Elara found herself asking, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. The king's smile was beautiful and terrible as winter starlight. "You will enter the labyrinth of echoes, a place where the barriers between past and present grow thin, and retrieve something that was lost long ago. If you succeed, you will have proven your worth to both courts. If you fail, you will join the shadows that walk its paths for eternity." The pronouncement settled over the assembled court like a shroud, and Elara could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as the implications became clear. She was to be sent into some kind of supernatural maze, tasked with retrieving an object whose nature and location remained undefined, with her life hanging in the balance. "The labyrinth has claimed many seekers over the centuries," Lady Morwen said, her voice carefully neutral. "Few who enter ever find their way out again." "Which is what makes it such an appropriate test," Thane replied, his smile as cold as his sister's had been. "Either the mortal proves herself worthy of the gifts she has inherited, or she pays the ultimate price for her presumption." "The test is set," the king declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. 3 days hence, at the setting of the moon, she will enter the labyrinth. Until then, she may prepare herself as she sees fit." The audience was clearly at an end, and Elara found herself being escorted from the throne room by Kieran and Lady Morwen, while Thane remained behind to discuss details with the king. The walk back to her chambers passed in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what the next 3 days might bring. "The labyrinth of echoes," Kieran said once they were safely behind the crystal door of her room. "I had hoped never to hear that name spoken again." "You know of it?" Elara asked, settling onto her bed with legs that had suddenly become unsteady. "Know of it? I've been inside it." Kieran moved to the window, staring out at the alien stars with an expression that spoke of memories he would rather forget. "The labyrinth is not simply a maze, it's a living thing, fed by the fears and regrets of those who enter it. It shows you echoes of your past, distorted versions of your memories designed to trap you in endless loops of guilt and self-recrimination." "What did you go there to retrieve?" Lady Morwen asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity. "My mother," Kieran replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She had been taken by the labyrinth during one of the king's earlier tests, lost to the shadows that walk its paths. I thought I could save her, bring her back to the world of the living." "And did you?" Elara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I found her," Kieran said, turning away from the window to face them. "Or rather, I found what she had become. The labyrinth had fed on her regrets, her sorrow at leaving me behind, until there was nothing left but an echo of pain wearing her face. She begged me to stay with her, to join her in the eternal torment that had become her existence." "But you left," Lady Morwen observed. "I left," Kieran confirmed, "and every day since I have wondered if that makes me strong or simply heartless." The weight of his confession settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and Elara found herself struggling to process the implications. If the labyrinth could corrupt someone as strong as Kieran's mother, what hope did she have of surviving its influence? "What was I sent to retrieve?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The king didn't specify," Lady Morwen replied. "But given the circumstances, I suspect it will be something connected to your grandmother. The labyrinth has a way of making its tests personal." "My grandmother never entered the labyrinth," Elara protested. "She died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by family." "Her body died," Kieran corrected gently. "But the labyrinth doesn't only claim the living. It feeds on powerful souls, drawing them in even after death if they have unfinished business or unfulfilled promises. If Nessa made any bargains she didn't complete, any oaths she didn't fulfill, the labyrinth might have claimed her spirit." The possibility sent a chill through Elara that had nothing to do with temperature. Her grandmother had been the wisest person she had ever known, but wisdom and innocence were not the same thing. If Nessa had dealt with the Fae for decades, it was entirely possible that she had made bargains whose terms she had been unable to meet. "I need to prepare," Elara said, rising from the bed with renewed determination. "If I'm going to face this thing, I need to understand everything I can about my grandmother's magic and the pendant she left me." "I can help with that," Lady Morwen offered, though something in her tone made Elara suspicious. "Of her motives." "As can I," Kieran added. "Though I should warn you that preparation can only do so much. The labyrinth's greatest weapon is not physical danger but psychological manipulation. It will show you things that never were and things that might have been, all designed to make you lose sight of your true purpose." "Then I'll have to hold tight to who I am," Elara said, touching the pendant at her throat, "and trust that my grandmother's protection will be enough to see me through." "Perhaps," Lady Morwen said, her expression unreadable. "But remember, mortal the Fae do not send their servants on impossible quests out of cruelty. If the king believes you can succeed, then there is something about you, something about your heritage, that gives you an advantage the rest of us lack. Or he simply doesn't care whether I live or die," Elara replied, though she hoped that wasn't the case. "Oh, he cares," Lady Morwen assured her, her smile sharp as winter wind. "The question is whether his interest lies in your success or your failure. Either outcome serves his purposes in different ways." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and instruction. Kieran taught her what he could remember about the labyrinth's layout and the nature of the echoes that inhabited it, while Lady Morwen provided lessons in the subtle arts of Fae magic and the ways to recognize illusion from Onaraz. Reality. Her grandmother's journal proved invaluable, containing detailed notes about the properties of the pendant and the specific incantations needed to activate its more powerful protections. Nessa had apparently anticipated that her granddaughter might one day need such knowledge, and she had prepared accordingly. "The pendant responds to will and necessity," one passage read. "In moments of greatest danger, when death or transformation seem inevitable, speak the words of unbinding and let the accumulated power flow through you. But be warned, such magic comes with a price, and using it will mark you as something more than mortal in the eyes of both courts." On the evening before the test, as the alien stars wheeled overhead and the crystal walls pulsed with their eternal light, Elara sat in her room reviewing everything she had learned. The pendant at her throat was warm against her skin, and she could feel a subtle vibration running through the metal as if it were preparing itself for what was to come. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. She called for the visitor to enter, expecting to see Kieran or Lady Morwen. but instead found herself facing a figure she didn't recognize, a fey woman whose beauty was somehow more approachable than the terrible perfection of the court ladies she had met. "I am Lyria," the woman said, inclining her head in a gesture that was respectful without being servile. "I served your grandmother during her time in our realm, and I have something that belongs to you." She extended her hand to reveal a small crystal vial filled with liquid that seemed to contain captured starlight. "Nessa asked me to give this to her granddaughter if she ever came to our court. She said you would know when to use it." Elara accepted the vial with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of her grandmother's foresight and preparation. Even in death, Nessa was still trying to protect her, still guiding her steps through the treacherous landscape of fey politics and ancient magic. "What is it?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be cryptic. "A single drop of the water that flows at the heart of all labyrinths," Lyria replied. "It will show you the true path when all others seem false, but it can only be used once. Choose carefully when that moment comes." The woman disappeared as suddenly as she had arrived, leaving Elara alone with her preparations and the weight of tomorrow's trial. She tucked the vial carefully into her cloak alongside her grandmother's journal, then spent the remaining hours before dawn reviewing everything she had learned about the nature of echoes and the power of regret. When morning came, bringing with it the pale light that filtered down from Valewind's alien sky, Elara was as ready as she could be for whatever the labyrinth might hold. She dressed in the traveling clothes that had appeared in her wardrobe garments that seemed designed for both elegance and practicality, and made her way to the great hall where the assembled court waited to witness her departure. The Autumn King sat upon his throne like a figure carved from living shadow, his beauty terrible and magnificent in the crystal light. Beside him stood Thane, his silver eyes cold as winter stars, while Lady Morwen and Kieran flanked the space before the throne like silent guardians. "Are you prepared?" the king asked, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I am," Elara replied, though she felt anything but ready for what was to come. "Then let us see if you are truly worthy of the gifts you have inherited," the king said, rising from his throne with fluid grace. "The labyrinth awaits."